Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. We'll get into the questions in just a minute, but I did want to say thank you to all of you that have been joining in on the Midweek Roundup live, but also those that watch on repeat, either on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook or on YouTube. So we appreciate you being a part of the conversation virtually as we're live or not. We appreciate those of you that also listen to the audio-only podcast version that is now over 3,600 downloads. Very excited to see the success of the Roundup continuing to grow in the international education community. And as we do each week, we take the questions that we ask here on Wednesday from our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings. And for those of you who are not aware, we've produced a newsletter for the last 4 years called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and actually it's about 6 years now. And we're very proud of that. We're now close to 2,000 subscribers between the 2 different versions we have of the newsletter, both in an email format that comes into your inbox every Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can get that through subscribing on our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. Fill in your details and we'll get back to you with that next Monday with the next edition. Or if you prefer to get your international ed news through LinkedIn, you can subscribe there. Also, look for all the SMIE news fit to share, and you'll be able to find that subscription page. So as we do, we take those themes that we see developing in a newsletter and create the questions that we ask here on Wednesdays around some of the common issues that we see popping up on a regular basis in those news stories. So this week, our first question is, can advocacy move the needle on visa issues? Now, international education has really prided itself on having strong advocacy groups to go fight the battles we need fought as an industry with our elected representatives and with the relevant federal departments on campus that in the U.S. government that impact and define policy related to international students and international education. And there are a number of different groups that do that. The membership associations like NAFSA, ACE, AIEA, AIRC, International ACAC, NACAC, and a variety of other APLU, AACSU. All of these membership organizations for higher ed members are very important in the overall scheme of things. There are probably 17 to 20 odd organizations that are national organizations that have advocacy elements in them. Is also the President's Alliance and the Alliance for Academic and International and Academic Exchange. There are also groups. We now have this coalition, U.S. for Success Coalition. That's kind of an umbrella group for all of these advocacy efforts that has been fighting the good fight for us on Capitol Hill for international ed issues. In the past, the Alliance and President's Alliance have had, and NAFSA and International ACAC, NACAC have all had advocacy days where groups of members go to the Hill and meet with their elected representatives. So there's been a strong tradition of this in international education. And in years past, probably pre-teens, we saw international education into the maybe late 90s, early 2000s as a white hat issue. And in political terms, that means it's pretty much a bipartisan issue when it comes to support for international education efforts. What has happened in certainly the teens, certainly in the last 8, 9, 10 years, is those international education issues, particularly for inbound students, have often got intertwined with a lot of the politics around immigration. So it has become a much more since immigration has become a much more divisive issue politically across the United States. Unfortunately, international education has kind of got swept up in that and often gets included in very anti-immigrant legislation. Certainly the previous President Trump under his administration from 2020 2017 to 2021 really had that as part of their DNA in terms of the messaging and a lot of the initial steps they took with executive orders in the first days of their administration in January of 21, the Muslim travel bans that were implemented into 7 countries, 3 of which weren't Muslim. But those countries really kind of started reality of a very much a policy perspective in the previous administration of anti-immigration. Those may be changing. Times may be changing on those fronts. We've seen some movements on both sides to kind of make it a little easier for international students to make their way here and potentially stay here. But those are all down the road pieces that may require further action. But there are 2 kind of main issues that are bubbling to the surface now when it comes to visa issues. We saw in the past year there had been a report that Shorelight had been a part of, along with a number of other related groups that looked at visa denial rates in the global south. That for particularly in Africa, there was data that shared that there was 57% of African students were being denied visas. There's all sorts of challenges to the kinds of denial rates that you see published, which the State Department really doesn't do, but they've been able to. Some groups have been able to discern that. So there's that group when it comes to visa rates, denial rates for visas for students in Africa, in the global south. And there's also been the more recent issues, which seem to be perennial issues lately, of extensive visa wait times, particularly in South Asia and India in particular. India has been kind of a shining light in recent years because of the rapid growth of Indian applicants coming to the United States, or at least applying for access to the United States for study. We've seen the numbers grow in terms of Indian students coming over the last decade, that they now have surpassed China as the overall largest sending country to the United States. The graduate enrollments have really been driven, and overall international student number growth has been driven largely by a huge growth in Indian graduate enrollments. And the current ambassador to India has Eric Garcetti, former mayor of Los Angeles, has had a really successful PR campaign in terms of developing, and he keeps claiming how Biden tasked him from day one to sort out that visa mess in India. They've had the opening of a new consulate in Hyderabad with many more windows for student interviews, where 80% of U.S.-bound Indian students come from the AP and Telangana states in India. That has helped, but still so much more is needed. The wait times are 100, 200 days for some students that are applying now for student visa appointments at embassies and consulates in South Asia. So that's clearly going to put them well past the start of the fall term, and meaning that the supply of available appointments does not come close to meeting the demand for student visa appointments. And this is even after the folks in India had gone to great lengths to weed out a lot of the agents that were kind of fake agents or fraudulent agents that were buying up or taking up available appointment times and then selling them to students. They cut that out this past 2 or 3 months by requiring specific passport information for students in order to book those appointments. Whether they've just figured out a workaround to get any number of valid passport information from potential applicants, not actual applicants yet, that might be the case. But in any way you look at it, the supply of available appointments is not meeting the current demand for visas in most of South Asia. So there's been 2 groups that have advocated, and some of the same people are in both groups, but you have those coalition of association members that I've mentioned earlier, a letter to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on behalf of a consortium of 20 higher ed organizations, including ACE, urged the government to address the delays for F1 and J1 visas. He wrote that some students are being offered initial interview appointments 100 to 200 days after they apply. And that's not only hurts the students that are trying to secure their papers before the start dates of their academic year in the fall. And the article in Inside Higher Ed also goes on to say that some enrollment-dependent institutions rely on these new students for financial survival. So we'll see. That's a letter directly to Anthony Blinken on behalf of these association members. And there is also the separate group that is related to the visa denial rates in South Asia. Interestingly, this particular effort has also gotten the backing of a group of largely, I think almost exclusively Democratic representatives, senators, 7 senators led by Senator Pete Welch from Vermont. I have asked Secretary Blinken again to update their student visa adjudication guidance to ensure that all qualified students have an equal opportunity to continue their academic journey in the U.S. They cite data on the past 8 years obtained on the visa rates, denial rates for students from African countries, significantly higher than from other regions in the world, and that's there is a need for greater transparency, greater equal access to a U.S. higher education through a student visa that the student visa allows. So they're asking, the senators are asking the State Department to ensure guidance to staff that are doing the interviews, those kind of fresh out of the boat foreign service employees. The first posts are assignments are typically as visa officers, consular officers. So the goals of this is to better instruct those new folks to make sure that they are adjudicating fairly all the student applicants that are coming. And so that's really something that is seeing a real uptick in interest in the higher ed community to put pressure on State Department to better have a better and more even-handed approach toward the visa adjudication process for students from the Global South. So that's certainly risen up on the radar. Does it make a difference? Does it move the needle? I think so. I think whenever you have senators also putting pressure on the State Department, not just the associations, I think that certainly can help improve access to change in these student visa categories. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. So any certain time we get any news on any changes, we'll certainly make those part of our roundup discussions on the Wednesdays. But we want to stay on the diplomatic front for a little bit here with our second question, and that is, do diplomatic gaffes impact student interest? I mentioned earlier at the top, I wasn't going to bring this in, but about in January of 2017, when President Trump was inaugurated, he announced a series of executive orders, and one of those was an executive order to ban visa applicants coming to the United States from certain primarily Muslim countries. It became known as the Muslim travel ban. Even though exemptions were carved out for students from those countries, particularly Iran, which has a large sending population to the United States, the impact of that in terms of PR, in terms of messaging to the rest of the world was, well, if you're Muslim, we don't want you in the United States. Kind of sadly what happened post 9/11 as well. Those 7 countries, even though only Iran was really a major sender to the United States, the numbers of students that were directly impacted outside of Iran was fairly nominal. But the impact had a depressing effect in 2017, 18, and 19 on international student interest, largely because of a continuing decline that had started probably 2015, 16 with students coming from China. But those numbers also happened, and then you had the pandemic in 2020. So a very unfortunate. And was that a diplomatic gaffe? I think so, because the way it got put out certainly did not help right on Inauguration Day in terms of these Muslim travel bans, and that had a long-term impact on international student numbers for at least the 2017, 18, 19 and was swallowed up by the pandemic in 2020. But in terms of that kind of a diplomatic gaffe, though it was by executive order, was still had deleterious impact on international student interest from certain parts of the world coming here, because they felt that, hey, this new administration isn't welcoming for overseas people, from whether immigrants, non-immigrants. It had a very much an anti-immigrant rhetoric in its campaign, and certainly in its initial actions in their first few months in office. That has continued throughout their presidency and is ramping up again, but maybe less severely. In terms of legal immigration, certainly has not been a target as much for the certainly current Trump campaign. So we'll see what happens after Election Day, but a lot of changes coming, I'm sure, one way or the other. But the diplomatic gaffe that I'm particularly referring to today is one we've covered in the newsletter a couple times over the last week or two, and that has to do with Deputy Secretary of State, his comments. Kurt Campbell, Deputy Secretary of State, he said that Chinese students, and this is a couple weeks ago at a policy forum, the Council of Foreign Relations China Strategy Initiative launch, he called Chinese students coming to the U.S. should be, quote unquote, study humanities and social sciences instead of STEM subjects like particle physics. And there are obvious throwbacks to previous administrations, China strategy or China initiative that really took it to see many Chinese scientists, students coming to the United States, scholars, as potential spies, linked it to this military-civil fusion strategy by the government through specific universities where were funded by the military to send people to the U.S. to retrieve secrets and collect patent pending content and research and steal that and send it back to China. That was the whole reason behind Trump's China initiative. And what that is, there's been a series of legal cases, only one of which resulted in a conviction. And Karen Fisher, in her Latitude newsletter today, reports that was just overturned. So there's a lot of past administration actions that still have impacts today related to this, where students from China that were in STEM subjects, particularly if they're coming from these military fusions, civil military fusion schools, they were basically put into the equivalent of administrative processing for months at a time, and very rarely got visas to come, and because of the fear of they're coming here to steal our technology. And that hasn't gone away. And what the Deputy Secretary of State's comments weren't exclusively to say, don't come to the U.S. if you're in China and are interested in STEM subjects. It was unfortunately taken that way. And some publications in China, to nobody's surprise, who's been in the industry for more than a minute, they picked up on those comments and called Campbell's words U.S. racism and arrogant in another column. And that's a piece from South China Morning Post, based in Hong Kong, but certainly a mouthpiece in many respects. China Daily picked up on this, China Times, also Chinese Communist Party mouthpieces in country. But South China Morning Post is based in Hong Kong. It's a little bit more open to the West, shall we say, but the comments are being taken by young people and their families, weighing up the comments and saying, wow, I guess maybe I don't want to study in China, in the United States, if I'm interested in a STEM program. But if I'm in humanities, great. So is that being seen as negative in China? I can see no reason why it wouldn't be. To say that, hey, but the encouraging piece of it is that we want to see more humanities, social scientists from China coming to the U.S. Great. I'm sure all of us in the United States would welcome that, but not to the expense of not having also quality Chinese students coming in the STEM subjects. And that's basically the equivalent of what Deputy Secretary of State Campbell's comments were driven toward. And that is something that we all need to take a look at in the United States, and certainly diplomats should know better in terms of when they're making these comments, even though it was in a forum about China for the Council of Foreign Relations, a very well-known group in the United States. Those comments will get heard elsewhere and reported back to countries that might be the unintended target of it. Or intended in this case. But the likelihood is that he didn't mean it to say, don't come if you want STEM. But I'm certainly it wasn't encouraging in terms of the tone and language that he used. So the realization is that, hey, his comments did not go down well to students in China that want to come and be studying the STEM fields and research fields that are STEM heavy. So do they matter? Do they affect student behavior and interest? Absolutely they do. And that's one of the things that I think we always, in international education, we always cringe sometimes when we hear our politicians talking about things that, even though they may be messages to their local audiences and constituents that makes sense for that constituency, the implications of what they say, oftentimes if it gets picked up and taken differently than it might have been intended, or the tone is a certain way in a message to local constituents, those can get magnified and blown up in the wrong ways internationally when it impacts potential incomings and outgoings. And to be honest, politicians rarely think about the world first. Their jobs are dependent on their constituents' views and how they respond to their actions, and their words. And this is something that is nothing we get around. I even had a colleague of mine, one of my best friends growing up. We went to high school and university together, grad school together, and he went into the Foreign Service. He's been in the State Department off and on in DC posts and around the world posts for well over 25 years now. And probably now 30 years now, yeah. And he told me first that in terms of policy, State Department wise, from a State Department perspective, when, for example, President Trump came to office and his policy was America first in terms of how the State Department was directed to implement foreign policy initiatives that took that into account as a U.S. foreign policy first, or America first. That he said that's really not, that approach really wasn't all that much different than previous administrations. Some of the implemented actions he did correct, like the Muslim travel bans were significant, and it's all about presentation in terms of how he talked about it. But in terms of similar policies, there weren't dramatic differences. So these diplomatic gaffes do matter. So last question of the day in terms of what we'll cover here on the Roundup is the question of international student caps and whether they are the answer at individual universities. Now, we've seen this obviously with what Canada did last year when they announced the 30% cap or reduction in their international student study permits that were going to be issued for this year, 2024, and for 2025. And we've seen Australia announce a net migration cap or reduction of 50%, and that's not just for students, it's overall. And we've seen the dependent study ban in the UK result in a significant drop in visa applications, 28% I think it was most recently for the coming fall term for deposits. So the countries have certainly started to take that cap question very seriously. The numbers are there, and the realities have been coming for a while. And if you've been in the industry and you've had a global perspective for any number of years beyond the last 2 or 3, you know that this was coming because the capacity or percentage of higher ed enrollments in these countries that are now facing these cap issues had risen dramatically from 20 to 25% to 25 to 30% in the last decade. And the results of that are, some of them fairly dramatic in Canada's perspective, where you almost had a doubling in the last 10 years of international students in that country, up to almost a million this past year, and that's vocational and post-secondary bachelor's, master's, doctoral students. the numbers were straining limits. And straining limits at individual institutions, not so much on the financial side, because financially these institutions were lopping them all in. As many international students as they can get, they were taking in. At some of the private colleges in Canada, vocational colleges, you would have 90% of the students being international in some places, and that's just not sustainable. It's sustainable financially for that institution, but is that a place where students want to go? To receive a vocational education, other than as a pathway to potentially stay in the country and work and maybe become a resident someday. So the countries have had, as a result of the kind of the lack of regulation on or lack of restraint, maybe it's a better term, on the behalf of the universities that are in colleges that have been enrolling these students, to bring in more students than they could handle. And when I say handle, it's not just have more classrooms to teach in and to educate these new arrivals from abroad in. It's having having a realization, a moment, and to look beyond their bottom line as institutions, to think about the implications to bringing so many more students in from abroad that require housing, that require local services not provided by the university, health services, transportation, all these other things, work permission, all of these things, on the local communities that they weren't ready for. It's as an institution, you're bringing them in, your responsibility to teach them, but the knock-on effects at most institutions in Canada, UK, Australia, where they're dealing with these cap issues, they didn't have the housing to take care of these students. They never thought about the implications on their local communities on housing and services that these students would need as new arrivals from abroad, and the potential impacts long-term at the institutional level and at the vocational level, at social level economically in those countries, how they would cope with all these extra students from abroad. So you now have a situation where these countries have had to make caps, and the reality is many of these institutions are now thinking about imposing caps on the number of international students that they're going to enroll. And there's a really, I think, useful article here from ICEF Monitor. And it says, what is the right balance of international enrollment in post-secondary education? And it goes through the design and implementation of enrollment caps, not like we've been talking about at the national level in these countries, but about individual institutions, what they have kind of wised up and said, wow, we don't have purpose-built housing in a big enough supply on our campus, if at all, for our overseas students. We need to be better partners in our communities to work with them town and gown in terms of developing housing that's more that brings rents down, is more accommodating, and can provide for all the needs of the community, not just the international students, which clearly aren't served well by the lack of housing in many of these communities. We don't have that problem in the United States largely because our campuses are, in the larger part, are designed as residential institutions where we have purpose-built housing on our campuses or right near us that we work. Our institutions work with investor groups to build housing that are kind of residential, commercial places with restaurants and other services on the first floor of apartment buildings, and then 3, 4, or 5 levels of housing above that. So we kind of know how to do housing well for international students and for our domestic students, because that's part of the culture here. It's not in most other countries. Some might have a very limited supply of houses because they bring in, if they're a public institution, might be bringing in students from around the country domestically, so they might have some purpose-built housing, but rarely is that extended for international students. So these are the questions that we see, and the only other place we really see international student-specific housing developed on campuses has been in China, oddly enough, over the last 20 years. So these caps are coming into play, and institutions are starting to think about this. And this is happening not just in the major destinations, Australia, Canada, UK, but also in the Netherlands, where they've been told that there's going to be a cap, there's going to be limits, so you need to plan for that in terms of the number of students that you can actually have on your campus. There's the Vice Chancellor of Deakin University in Australia, who we also profiled last week, that they are the first institution anywhere to open up a campus in India for their purposes as part of the new national education policy in India. They have argued for an alternative to a government mandated cap, that this Vice Chancellor has proposed that each Australian university would voluntarily hold its foreign student numbers below a benchmark of 35% of total enrollments. Right now, he further suggests that no more than 50% of the foreign enrollment at any given institution should come from any one country, and that there should be no more than 40% of foreign students in any one faculty or field of study within the university. And that's a particularly interesting one. I know that in a lot of U.S. schools, particularly those that practice CPT Day 1 at master's level, a lot of business programs that are seated programs still tend to be heavily dominated by students from one country, and you know which country I'm talking about. MBA programs around the world. I know I worked at an institution where when I started with them, there were 90% of the MBA students in that program were from India. And that had a really significant impact on the overall quality of that program. So to have a cap of 40% of foreign students in any one program of study certainly would have significant implications, not only in these countries, Australia, UK, and Canada, but in the US if we were to ever go that route. And is that a bad thing to have these conversations? And I would say no. I mean, to institutions that have really ridden the gravy train for a number of years and have really benefited financially as institutions by bringing in all these additional students, a lot of times the balance isn't factored into the conversation in terms of where these students are coming from. We don't care. They're paying their bills, so the more the merrier. But the realities of the situation are there are, whether top down or bottom up in certain countries, that these caps are being implemented. And whether it's smart to do that, I certainly would err on the side of yes, it would be a smart thing to do for institutional health and diversity and all of the other factors that we would like to see at an institution to truly thrive and grow and be everything we want it to be in terms of representation of our communities and our missions as institutions. You see the conversations happening where, hey, these limits are maybe something we need to be considering a lot more closely. And there are a couple articles that were in the newsletter this week particularly from the UK, talking about platforms with the new Labour government, what that's going to mean, and limits and financial difficulties that are going to be new realities for institutions, and what that means for new numbers coming in. So there's going to be a lot to happen there in the English language sector in the UK. They are restricted right now. They can't really grow more because of housing, bed shortages, and a lot of the beds that English language programs rely on are short-term housing places, host families. There just aren't enough of those beds available. So those are some of the real things. 7,000 more beds were needed from 91 English UK members. So that is those housing shortages that are these is forcing these English language programs to restrict intakes, because they've come to a realization we can't bring in more students than we have housing for, and that's a very healthy realization to have, but it's one that certainly many institutions are probably just getting to the point where they have to have these conversations on campus. We're not there in the U.S. yet at most schools. Very few have that very significant issue. Only the top, most elite programs that are already have 20-25% of their student body being international. There's some that might have closer to 30, but those are very few and far between. So capacity-wise in the U.S., we can handle more. Many of these countries can't anymore. So the rubber is meeting the road this year, and the consequences are now coming to fruition in terms of what the years of excess have meant. And we'll see what happens in the years to come. Well, that's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. We appreciate you being a part of the conversation with us, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon. Cheers.